So Maria, I think that we are all about 50 people here. So if you are okay, we can start. I will give a brief introduction about ReDe. ReDe is Rethinking Development. This is, we call it at the beginning reading group, but it's more like a network for the students and people who are enthusiastic about development, and not only about development, but to learn about other things that usually we don't learn in the curriculums in economics. So we are more or less focused on economics students, because we know that, for example, sociologists, anthropologists, they have historians, they have like a broad vision, but unfortunately in economics, at least in Colombia, is a bit narrow, the focus. So we are like trying to expand it and to have like horizontal discussions with the students. We had recently one in which basically we were discussing the importance of having other narratives, learning from other historical perspectives, because even when you're understanding how United Kingdom and United States get developed and get this high stage of progress, we learn only one of the parts of the history, and we associate this with liberalism and laissez-faire, but we are like trying to understand better how the complete historical process, and to see that is more complex than a formula. So the team is here is Isabela Muñoz, Ivonne Castillo, Álvaro Morales, Daniela Perez, and Nicolas, who was in the previous session, our translator, but he is not here, unfortunately. And now we are happy, extremely happy, to have Maria Bach, Dr. Maria Bach. She will be presenting us her paper and her findings about the Indian economics, and how this is a win-win model that we basically don't know. I think that we don't know that model here in Colombia, and we have not heard that much about different authors, different to the ones that we learn from the American authors and European authors and some local and Latin American thinkers, but we don't know much about other thinkers. So we are extremely happy to have you here. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself and tell us other details important that you consider for this conference. So Maria, before you start, we are having here students from economics, but also we did like a public call. So there are many people who are not students. There are people who are doctors, who are professionals. So we have like a big group, interdisciplinary and big group. So thank you, Maria. And so go ahead, please.
There's no pressure then, yeah? Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction. I guess an additional thing I do want to just say is that I studied economics and mathematics as my undergrad, actually, where I'm teaching now at the American University of Paris, but by professors that were heterodox. I had a Marxist, I had a Keynesian, etc. Right? So I was already kind of molded into a student that would question the neoclassical models that we are bombarded with as undergraduate students. And then I went on to do development economics at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, which, as many of you probably know, concentrates on other parts of the world than Europe, which is really, or Europe and America, which we kind of tend to concentrate on in economics. Now, I do have some slides. I've just realized that you have disabled the sharing tool. Is it possible? Do you think it's going to be possible for me to share my slides?
Yes, of course.
I take the advantage of this spare time to remind you, I will say it in Spanish for Colombian students, que hay un link en el chat de Zoom para quienes se quieran unir a ese Google Meet. Ahí mis compañeros Daniela y Álvaro van a estar como apoyándolos si tienen preguntas, considerando que no tenemos traductor el día de hoy, desafortunadamente. Entonces, si sienten que hay algo en lo que se pierden, que no están seguros de la pregunta, Álvaro y Daniela van a estar súper pendientes para ayudarles. Entonces, no tengan temor ni nada. Es para que todos participemos. Las preguntas las pueden hacer igual en español aquí en este chat. Y eso es. So I was just saying that we will have this Google Meets space in which my colleagues Daniela and Álvaro will be helping you if you think that there is something that you don't understand quite well or you are not sure about your question. So they will be happy to answer. And the questions, I think that we can start, like, if the other people have questions, you can write it here in the chat, or you just can raise your hand and at the end of the presentation, and then Maria can reply. So thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, so you should all see my slides now. And yeah, as I said, I did this then, the Masters in Development Economics at SOAS, and I wrote a thesis on how the classical economists saw India and how India, the country, influenced the way the classical economists thought about development and thought about the world history. And when I started my PhD at King's College London, I realized that lots of people had written on this already and thought, no, I mean, and then just kind of stumbled upon one of my protagonists that I then ended up writing my thesis on, and just thought, wait, there's some stuff. This is an economics text. Why hasn't this been dealt with as an economics text before? That's why I landed with this then eventually. And this is really an article that was published based on my penultimate kind of last chapter of my PhD thesis, which will become a book at some point in the near future, hopefully. So that is the introduction, right? And so why do I do this, right? Why is it important to bring to feature economists that haven't been dealt with as economists before, and that clearly haven't written as much on economics as perhaps someone like Adam Smith or David Ricardo or Karl Marx, etc., right? And apart from the fact that I think it's very interesting to give agency to figures that have clearly come up with ideas and we can find new ideas in that, it is also that these thinkers themselves thought that it was important that the East, India, had its own thinkers. And just read this quote here: "The East must produce its own thinkers, its own historians, its own economists." So they themselves in the late 19th century saw the need for Indians themselves to start writing about their economy, to start studying it. And this particular person here, Ramesh Chandra Dutt, is actually the first agricultural economist in India, and he's really known as the founder of agricultural economics in India. And he saw the theory that Amartya Sen came up with in 1970, which is that very famous famine theory, which states that famines are not caused by lack of supply, but rather lack of access to supply. So i.e. poverty. People just don't have the money to buy food that has now become more expensive because there's a drought, right? And this Ramesh Chandra Dutt, he goes out into the rural areas and finds data and proves this, right? Sure, it is less sophisticated than Amartya Sen in the 1970s because he had less time. He was also a nationalist fighting for independence, but he also had less tools, right, as anybody in the 19th century compared to the 20th century, right? And it's quite interesting that Amartya Sen, you know, cites Ramesh Chandra Dutt in his famine theory book, but he puts him in the bibliography, but not in his citation. So he doesn't actually discuss Dutt at any point. There's an issue here, right? We need to give these protagonists more agency. And I hope I do that in my research, and I hope to continue. So one of the things, though, that I really had to struggle with in my research is understanding, okay, these economists are not seen as economists. How then does that affect their thinking and the way that they write, in what contexts, in what mediums? You know, they did lots of speeches, they wrote some articles, they wrote lots of letters that they then published, etc. And so what I came up with is this idea of from and at the margins. So these, if you see here, the idea of development, which is the green circle, and you have David Ricardo with his comparative advantage theory, you have Adam Smith with his idea of stages, you have Friedrich List, who says, you know, you need to protect your infant industry, etc. And I could go on. Some people that you might know less about is the Saint-Simonians here in the middle of the circle, which are a group of French scholars in the beginning of the 20th century who really are the first scholars to come up with this idea of development. Like, we can actually do something about the world and bring about positive change, right? Before, scholars saw just the world kind of just happening, right? They saw the world regressing sometimes, progressing other times, but the Saint-Simonians in the beginning of the 20th century said, oh, we can actually do something about this, right? Okay, so that is the kind of dominant idea of development, if you will, the kind of ideas that, you know, people who study development know this. Well, we have this little circle here, yellow circle, the form doesn't actually matter. It can be a square. But anyway, and this is our Indian economics, right? And if we zoom in a little bit here, my idea then in my research is that I try to figure out where they got their ideas of. And that's where this yellow circle goes over the green circle, right? They're clearly reading these texts from Europe. Some of them even read German. So they would have read Friedrich List's original books, and they were educated in the imperial universities in India, so they spoke English very, very well, and they were very connected. There were elites in India, so even though they are marginalized, as I said, they're from the margins, right? They're still very well connected, and so they have you see ideas in their texts from these thinkers that come before them that are very well known. But there's also a part, and this is where this article really the focus lies, is where this yellow circle overlaps with the blue, the background, right? This is where they're coming up with new thoughts, right? New ideas, but they're additions, right? They're redefining at the margins. This is what I mean by at the margins, right? They're not revolutionizing development, and that's important. I don't want to over exaggerate that, right? Doesn't mean that we shouldn't give them attention, right? But I don't want to exaggerate that. Now, another way that I've been kind of recently been exposed to of framing this and where these economists are is thinking about it in terms of relocating economics, saying, okay, we concentrate way too much, and Camilla said it at the beginning, we concentrate way too much on European and American economists and the way they thought about the economy and the way they think about the economy today. And we kind of deny other types of history, other types of development paths, and other schools of thought, right? And so for me, my research is really about relocating economics. It's relocating where we look, right? It's not that we should ignore all the European and American economists, but at least I think scholars like myself need to exist, right? Okay. Fantastic, right? So here we have the three scholars that I decided to focus on. Now, a PhD may seem long at 4 years, but it is actually very short because you have to do something so focused. So I had to focus. There were about 9 Indian economists at the time I was looking at, from 1870 to 1905, which is the first generation of modern economists. And then there were lots of generations to come, obviously. But there were about 9 at this time, and I decided to just focus on these 3. The first one here in the bigger circle at the bottom is Naruji, Dabada Naruji, who's very famous for the drain theory. So he theorized that Britain was draining India of its resources, and that was why India was not doing well, not because it was barbaric, uncivilized, and just not capable of development, right? I'm being simplistic here for effect in the presentation. I'm much more nuanced in the article, which those of you who read it will know. But and then we have the middle guy here, Ramesh Chandra Dutt. He's the one that the quote came from at the beginning of the presentation. And as I said, he's the agricultural economist. He was the first to go out to the rural areas and really look at poverty, understand it. Why were the farmers poor, right? And this was really novel at the time, and even novel in Europe at this time, right? This is when Booth decides in London to go to the slums of London and actually analyze poverty there, where nobody else wanted to go before, right? Then there's another study by Boomtree, I'm saying his name wrong, but there's one in New York as well. And so that is really part of this movement here of analyzing poverty on the ground. And then the circle here to the furthest right is ReDe, Mahadev Govind ReDe, and I apologize to any Indian in the audience that I don't never say these names right. He was the founding father of Indian economics. He was the one in 1892 that said, we need an Indian economics, right? And his speech is called Indian Economics, and he says, this is really necessary for India in order for it to grow. And he was also very progressive in terms of, getting rid of costs, etc. And he is actually so all these thinkers are relatively well known in India, especially if you study politics, not so much if you study economics, and definitely if you studied the history of nationalism, right? These are huge figures there, but not in economics so much. Great. So what do I find here? Well, and I'm just going to check the time here because I don't want to talk for too long. So what I mean then by an Indian win-win model of development is that Indians, first of all, they rewrote Indian history. They said India has not just been poor its entire history, and then now the Brits have come and they have decided to civilize the country, right? This idea of the civilizing mission that the colonization had, right? No, India had actually been progressive in the past, and they had been one of the biggest global players in the markets, right? They called India as having kind of the role of the global supplier of manufacturing goods in the past, and they're not wrong here, right? It definitely plays into their nationalist rhetoric about, you know, we can run our own nation, but they're not wrong here, even though it may be exaggerated in certain texts that I've read. But that is really rewriting the way that Indian history was known, at least in Europe. And that definitely affected India, right? Because the British had control of the educational system in India, right? Then they said, okay, not only is your history of our country completely wrong, but also your analysis of what's going on right now is wrong, right? Remember Naruji's theory of drain, right? We've become a dependent imperial economy, and really they are the first economists in colonial territories to write about this, right? Then, you know, that it comes up later in the dependency theorists in the 1950s as well, but they are really the first to say, no, colonization actually drains our economies and inhibits us from growing, right? So it's not that it's our lack of ability to develop, but it is you ruining our ability to develop, right? That is what's going on. And we're becoming dependent on you for demand of our raw materials, and therefore not concentrating on industrializing, right? Which is what is going to bring the development that they need, right? And this is where I'm talking about win-win model of development. And it's quite actually very simple, right? It's this idea that reject David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage. We should not concentrate in what we are currently the most productive in, which was agriculture at the time, right? Raw cotton in particular, because that is not going to bring about the development that we need, right? We need industrialization. And in fact, if we all industrialize, and I'll go to my next slide here, if we all industrialize, actually, everyone will be better off, right? Just look at this quote here from Naruji. The question of our prosperity is as much the question of the prosperity of England and her working man. England's trade would be enriched by 250 million pounds if with our prosperity, each unit of the Indian population is ever able to buy from England goods worth only £1 per annum. Right? So, I mean, he's just doing very simplistic mathematics here, saying, I think the Indian population is this amount, and if we times that by £1, then that is the amount that England will be better off with, right? It's a very simplistic sentence, and it's not a model like David Ricardo's is, but it is an extremely important point, right? That you just do not see in any of the European theories at this time. The idea that other countries developing actually helps you develop too. I mean, just look at, you know, Friedrich List and his idea of the fact that Germany needed to industrialize. He said, you needed to protect your industry at first, right? Your infant industry. And so in the short term, that would hurt Britain, but in the long term, we should move to this universal society of free trade, right? So so Friedrich List said that, right? And I think these Indian economists, there's not direct evidence that they read him, but as I said, some of them read German and they were well aware of German economists at the time. He said, okay, this is great. This universal free society of, you know, this universal society of free trade is going to bring about this win-win model of development, right? But he said, not for Asia, because they're not capable. Right, so it's really, I mean, these economists, Indian economists are saying, oh, that's a great theory. You're saying it doesn't apply to us. It does apply to us, right? So they're taking, again, think about the circle that we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, right? That's that yellow kind of overlapping of the green, but also overlapping of the outside of the circle of the idea that's already existed. They're saying, we're going to take that theory and we're going to apply it to our economy, even though you think we're not capable, because we are, right? Now, the other thing that they do is that, which I think is really interesting. And a lot of scholars, one of my PhD supervisors who specialized in Indian history has found this too, and the Cambridge historians that are really excellent. They've also started to see this idea that Indians were really scholars in South Asia were really trying to reconcile nationalism with universalism. So they weren't saying, okay, we're going to completely deny the fact that there are universal processes that happen, because they were so connected to the world market that they couldn't deny the fact that there were universal things going on, that there were global forces that were going to affect them, right? But they also wanted to keep intact their history, right? Their industry, their way of being, etc., their way of seeing the world. And so just as a recap, most of you know this already, I'm sure, but economic nationalism in economics is when you see different paths of development for different countries, different areas. You place the nation as the unit of analysis, and you aim to increase the national well-being, as opposed to, in kind of indirect contrast in economics literature, to universalism, where you suppose universal processes of development. So you assume these stages of development that Adam Smith started with, but then you have the famous Rustow stages of development in the 20th century. And you place the individual as the unit of analysis, so rather than the nation, and you aim to maximize the individual's full potential rather than the nation, right? And the Indian economists in the late 19th century were saying, they're not at odds with each other, right? Again, think back to the win-win model of development, right? If we now concentrate on our industrialization, so if we concentrate on industrializing India, we can bring about, we can maximize every individual's full potential all over the world, right? And we can universalize industrialization, right? Now, the idea here is that they see, global history as this ebb of flow of development, right? They saw India as progressive in the global supplies of manufacturing goods around the 1600s or so, and then they saw it in decline, right? And definitely even was declining even in the late 19th century when they were writing, right? And they're saying, so India gave Europe the ability to industrialize when they did, right? And there are lots of examples of this, that Brits going to India and seeing the kinds of machinery that they were using and copying it and making it slightly more efficient, and then using it in Manchester. And there are lots of examples of this, right? And they see this, right? They're sitting here from India, far away, and they're not just Britain, where they're seeing a industrialized nation where they are, and an unindustrialization where India, and forgetting about history, right? So it's really interesting how they have a different viewpoint, these Indian economists, and they're obviously marginalized, so they're fighting for something as well, which the Brits aren't. So it's interesting how context really affects the way we see the world, and how we then, the kinds of theories we come up with. And because they were nationalists, because they were political activists, and there, some like Ramachandra Dutt was also a novelist, and they were doing lots of different things. So they weren't always so. The win-win model of development isn't like laid out 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's scattered across thousands of pages, and so there are pieces missing, etc. Right. And that is, we can't deny that, obviously. And so, yeah, concrete examples is sometimes hard to get. But the two things that I do know is that they wanted the development model to be to be a collective exercise, and that would minimize inequality. And that's the kind of national part of it, right? The nationalism of their development plan. And then the kind of international, the universal part of it is that in the long run, they definitely saw development as having a goal of having a universal society of free trade. And this is, Friedrich List talked a little bit about this in his works. Yeah. And as I said, what's new here is that they're applying it to the whole world, which Friedrich List did not. And so I don't know if this is necessary for my crowd here, but I do want to I like talking about this. So just to step it back to where we are today, and why this research I think is really important, right? And so, the impact, which we like to call it now in academia. I think that conceptual histories like the one I've done here on development make us reflect on how we organize our societies, right? Sure, I'm talking about a specific period, and I spend a lot of time delving into economic history and understanding the context and so on. And we can't be too anachronistic, right? We have to understand that their context was different than ours. But it still makes us reflect on how those histories impact the way we do things today, and whether there's things that we should rethink, right? And I think of that contextual analysis that I do and concentrating on overlooked individuals really can uncover marginal discourses, and I think that can help us with understanding our world. And so I think mainly for me, really, this is because I want to decolonize economics, right? It needs to be more global. It needs to get rid of Eurocentrism, among other things. Obviously, we have lots of work to do, but and I always like to give this example, and there are more, like this one I found a couple of years ago, and there are more examples now, better ones to do with economics. But this one, there was a campaign in Britain when I was doing my PhD on decolonizing the museum. And these are museums that we go to as children, and we learn about the world, and it starts there, right? Ideas around who counts, whose voice should be listened to, what theories should be taken as the truth and not, etc. Right? So thank you so much for having me, and now I am very excited for your questions.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I will like to start with having some questions, and I will invite all of the members and people here to start asking questions. I have many, but I will try to just say a couple of them. So the first question is, what is the mechanism, and why do you think that these authors were not really well known in Europe? And the second question is, if they were really known in India, and why maybe they were not acknowledged as economists? You were saying that they were more a political activists, and in your paper you were saying that they were taken by the British people like activists and nationalists, like enemies of the colony. But I was curious about how they were perceived in India, and why they don't get as academic or as economists for Western Europe, and why we never heard from them. What is the mechanism? Is through the academy, or yeah, I just want to have some of your ideas on it.
Yeah, excellent question. So just in general, first, why they're not well known. I mean, it's partly the dominance of the other authors. If you've taken you're an economics student, right? You know the kind of big, if you've taken a history of economics class, you will start with Adam Smith maybe, or maybe earlier with William Petty, but it's the big white men, right? That's it, and so that is why they're not known. It's just they're not given the space, right? And it's not necessarily that people don't want to read other authors. It's just that this is the narrative that's dominant and that comes about. And of course, I teach, right? I know that I can't teach everything, right? And there's lots of discussions now, right, in economics, like get your reading lists, make them less white, make them less male. But so just having 2 female authors on a list of 20 articles, is that enough? There's a change here that is starting to happen, but it's going to take a long time before that's balanced. And that's really why they're not well known. And really, there's also this part of the colonial legacy is not only physical, the fact that they drained actual resources from India, but it's intellectual, right? Indians were told they did not learn enough, right? That they did not know enough, and that when they did learn in the British universities in India, they regurgitated information and had no innovative thought. And I have actual quotations of people saying that, right? And Indians themselves were saying it, right? So there's a real colonial legacy here in intellectual thought about who is able to produce thought, right? And there's a real discrimination there that still exists today. And I think, I have Indian scholars who have said to me several times, like, it is good that there's a European looking at this because you're going to be taken more seriously, right? I don't think that's always true. It depends on the context, but there's something there that makes them think that's true, right? And I think it links back to this idea of the hierarchy of who gets listened to, you know? If I were born 50 years ago, I wouldn't be listened to either. I'm a woman, right? So we know this, right? We can understand this, and we're talking about this especially more this year, which is fantastic, right? I think we're all very lucky to be alive and working at this time. Now, why are they less known in India, right? So I think at the time, in the context that I look at, I think it's to do with the fact that, as you said, they were political activists. But again, this idea that, well, we should read the big thinkers. We should read the ones that come from Europe that know better. So it's linked to the same things I said before, and the fact that that there might be this consciousness or subconsciousness in India that they need to read the big thinkers from Europe, and so then there's limited time, right? And access. Now, the last thing I'll say is that because they were political activists, that means that they didn't write texts like The Wealth of Nations or The Theory of Moral Sentiments, or some of them did, but they're not the same structure. Some of them, as I said, they were books of just published letters to the colonial administration. And I really had to read thousands and thousands of pages to get together what they were saying, right? So they had a different goal and a different role in society than just scholars. And so therefore it's quite difficult perhaps to give yourself the time to read that many pages to get a sense of it. So yeah.
Okay,
That's
Maria.
a minor point though, but yeah.
Thank you,
Wow,
Maria.
that's
I just
you.
wanted to complement the question, because I was thinking maybe now we heard more about other thinkers from India, but not economists. So that's really a good, interesting question. We heard about Tagore and other great thinkers, but economists, this is like the first time we hear of them. Is it maybe because economics is more hierarchical and white dominated academia, or it has these research methods? Because maybe.
And just to add, here in Colombia is even worse, because I did my studies in United Kingdom and I heard some of the names. But here in Colombia, Maria, I think that this is what we like so much, what you are saying us, because we don't learn anything about other economists except for Dasgupta or Sen, but we don't have any other references. In Colombia, it's even worse.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Do you have that kind of subconscious too, about the fact that you place more importance on European thinkers? And look at the Indian scholars too, the ones that get out, right, that we know in Europe and America. Those are the ones that get jobs in American universities, right? I mean, Amartya Sen hasn't spent most of his life in India, right? As far as I've understood, they have to get out of India to get heard, and I've heard things like, I need to get, if I want to get my research read by Indians, then I need to get it published in Indian journals and so on, which is definitely one of my goals of my career, So it's also interesting that we think now with the internet that everything is just accessible, but yeah, you have to know about it to come to it and read it. Yeah, I just see a question here by Omar in the chat, right? Is it possible to speak of a convergence in growth between India and England, but not a convergence in development? So you're talking about the difference now between growth and development, which is fascinating. I do a whole topic on this in the course I'm teaching now with my students who are here. Right, so you could think about it that the economy grows and their raw cotton production, especially and their jute production, especially which is coarse cotton, right, increased during this time in the 19th century. But yes, their development decreased, right? Their poverty increased and so on. That's a good point. And there's some, I think it was, I forget the historian's name now, Morrison maybe. He argues that because taxes in India, land taxes during this time, colonial times, were so small, the government actually got very little revenue, and some of that revenue obviously left India to go to England. And so there was very little money actually for the government to invest in things like roads, schools, all those things that Adam Smith already theorized in the late 18th century that we need to invest in, all of us, right, as a collective, right? And so if you don't have government revenues, well, then you can't bring about development. So that's one reason why there would perhaps be, you know, convergence of growth, but not development. But there was, I mean, just to be clear, Omar, I don't think there was even convergence of growth. But they could, I don't know if you're wondering on the part of my opinion or my protagonist's opinion, but yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, I will translate a question that Maria posted here. She's asking if you know about some women economists in India, in the history of economic thought in India.
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't. But that would be great. You've just given me a research topic. No, I'm sure. So obviously, again, we have to think about the context. We have to think about discrimination and levels of inequality. And so the kind of access to education that Indian women would have had at this time would have been even less than in Britain, where there was some female economists at this time, which my colleagues in history of economics are starting to look at. But there was a study that I read recently, but it wasn't to do with economics. It was more to do with, politics, political activism. Yeah, I don't have the answer, but it's a good question, and I'm sure you can't. I don't think I can say there's no possibility of it being the case.
Okay, Maria, there is another question in the chat. It is in English. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah. So have you
it?
done research or found evidence linking these Indian authors with dependency school of yes? Have I found links between these and the dependency school in the 50s and 60s? Yes. Let me jog my memory of these names. Let me see which one it was. I want to get it right.
In your article.
Yeah,
I read it in your article.
Yeah, was it Prebish? I forget which.
Prebish and yeah.
I think it was Prebish that, yes, cites some of these Indian economists. And one of them has apparently been interviewed to say that this was, you know, one of the, when he read some of these texts, it revolutionized the way he saw global development and the way that the global market worked. Yeah, which is actually some research that I'd really love to do more on. I don't think there's a lot of research done on dependency school. You know, your last guest has done quite a lot, Michele, right? But I don't know if there's specific research on the link with India, but that is something I've wanted to pick up on. Yeah.
Okay, any other question in the chat? I have one question, but I invite people, please, to say your questions in Spanish. Don't be shy. I think that Maria is happy to reply all of you. I was really curious because I was telling you at the beginning of this talk, because we learned about David Ricardo and Smith, and I mean, I thought them like, you know, like these far authors that they have this general theory that it was like trying to explain what was happening at that time, but I never thought about the consequences of their ideas, especially in the case of David Ricardo, on the colonies, and how that idea was like preserving that specialization, that you have to go with raw materials and we would get the technology, and that was like a way to preserve that imperial structure. So I would like you to hear some thoughts about it, because I think that most of the students, they are taking lessons and learning about the Smith and Ricardo right now. So it would be really nice if you can explain a bit more your point for them.
Yeah, well, so the idea of comparative advantage is that you should specialize in what you're most efficient in. And I mean, it is a very simplistic mathematical model, right? And just saying that you should produce what you're most efficient in, but, you know, that doesn't, if there are two countries that one country produces more of both the goods, you know, if you have water bottles and watches, you know, if there's country A that produces more of those both, they shouldn't both produce those watches and water bottles. The country B who produces less should produce the good that it's most efficient in, or the difference between, let me see if I can explain this clearly. So the idea is that the country A, who produces the most goods of both, the most units of both, should produce the one that they're most efficient in, and the one that they're least efficient in, the other country should do it. And mathematically it works out, right? And so that way, the result is that there are more goods in the entire economy, right? In these two, if the globe has just two countries, right? But what you can see, and really I invite you to Google on YouTube and watch the first one that comes up. If you Google comparative advantage and you see this little, one that has little images and explains it very much better than I've just explained it, you can see that the numbers, right? So if country A is a developed country, industrialized country, and country B is an unindustrialized developing country, right? You can actually see that the result is, yes, both countries as a total produce more, but the country B that is developing, right, they will produce less. Well, what does that mean? Less money in their country. And I've never understood as an economics student, like, doesn't that jump out at you to say, why do that? And I think David Ricardo, and I'm not a specialist on him, but I think he would be turning in his grave to understand the kinds of, conclusions we've made on that model. It's very simple, and if for some contexts it makes sense, but not always. I just think there's lots of more questions here now, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, you want to read it?
Yeah, I can happily read. Yeah. So have you used any reference from Emeritus Sen? If you know him, what do you think about his papers on equity? So I know Emeritus Sen work on defining development, which I think is really fantastic, about why is it that we think about development as both a means and an end. Like development, the goal of development is development, but we need development in order to get development. I mean, that means that we're not very clear on what development is, right? And we need to do more work there. His work on equity, I don't think I specifically know anything about that in any kind of detail. Maybe perhaps linked to his ideas of the capability approach, which is the idea that you need to give people the ability to get out of poverty, right? And that means, being healthy, having the means to nourish yourself, getting an education, that kind of thing, which I think is fascinating and very important. It's then the kind of link between, okay, so what do we do with that knowledge? Is we can't just leave that to the private sector, which a lot of development institutions have been doing, right? IMF, the World Bank, but also institutions that set up private educational systems in developing countries, which now we're starting to see research that's really just not really leading to the results we want. Yeah. And then I see would you say Indian economics aimed at growth rather than development? Is there any particular approach given by Chandra and Naruji on the social side? Yes, good question. I didn't talk a lot about that in the presentation, but no, they're definitely development, right? So they're not just on growth, although this win-win model of development with the industrialization, I can see why you would think that. So ReDe talked a lot, as I said, about making the caste system less rigid so that people can move from profession to profession, right? So that we can get the most efficient people in the sectors that they're most efficient, get people into sectors where they're most efficient, right? Chandra talked a lot about Ramesh Chandra Dutt talked a lot about rural poverty, and that rural-urban inequality was really necessary to combat in order to bring about development. Naruji talked a lot about representation in the government, okay? So the fact that Indians needed to work in the government and they needed a vote, right? And he was actually the one that petitioned to get Indians to become a part of the Indian civil service, so a part of the colonial government. And Dutt, because he's a generation later, was the second ever Indian to get a place there, right? So it's interesting that Naruji's, yeah. So no, they definitely did have a social side. Naruji a little bit less than the other two, but then Vipul says, I was taught dependency theory in India in a heterodox department, but was never told that Prebish was inspired by some Indian thinkers. Thanks for this. Oh, that wasn't a question. Sorry about that. So I was wondering if there was a link between these Indian authors and the current trend of studies that involve RCTs in India. Oh, that would be very doubtful. I think, yeah, I don't think so. But it would be interesting that, you know, Duflo and Banerjee wrote that book, Poor Economics. I wonder if they're cited in that. I've definitely read it, but I haven't, but a while ago. I could look into it, but RCTs, I mean, no, I think they would think that that was ethically wrong, personally, if they lived today. But then let's see.
In Maria, sorry for interrupt you. I was thinking that actually in our next block of the seminar we are doing with our students, we are going to evaluate the RCT models, or in general quantitative usage of statistics in economics, and some critical views about it. And we are complemented it with, for example, Naila Kabir, recent critiques on Esther Duflo's paper that relies on RCT to answer a big question about is development or is it growth or something like that, like empowering women, helping development. And they had a very interesting conversation regarding this. And so we see there's here again these two sides of the world, the west and the east, talking about these important things. So we are going to talk about this in our study groups, and hopefully we will have also a specific webinar on this. So
that's great. Oh, if I'm allowed to join, that sounds amazing. I don't know very much about RCTs, but I know colleagues that are very. They really think it has done a disservice to development studies. So yeah. Then I will just say, in terms of like discrimination and stuff, it's great that Esther Duflo got the Nobel Prize, because there aren't enough female economists who've got that prize. If you know, we believe that quotas help, or numbers help, but yeah, I think and I think Poor Economics is a great book for any economic students to read, but they can just realize that the methodology that they use is questionable, especially in terms of ethics. But, so there's another question here. I'm talking about decolonizing India, but neoclassical models are still being taught in Indian economic schools. So what are us talking about? I'm not sure what Oma means here. I'm not sure I understand this.
Maybe it's like a reflection on we keep talking about decolonizing economics, but this neoclassical thing, and I see it's still being taught in India as well as in Colombia, and we are like still the colonies in this colonialistic system or view of the world. So I think it's a reflection on how we still think about decolonizing and still have these neoclassical models in our institutions. So that's true. Economics, it's been permeated by this great mainstreaming of this broad research, and that's why we are rethinking development and finding ways in which there are a lot of authors and great people like Maria doing interesting research on other things that are very important and very useful, and maybe we don't find them as easy in our main careers.
Yeah, and I think it's important as students to rebel, right? To say, why are you teaching us this? You know, why can't we look at this? You know, I've just had my students write their own syllabus for development this semester for the first time, and it's been amazing. I'm going to learn so much. I already have, you know. It's about you putting pressure. Some professors will tell you no way, you know, but there are lots of professors that will say, yeah, let's do it. You know, Well, you have to also understand that we have a research agenda, right? So our teaching is something we do as well as research, right? And so once we have a curriculum, a syllabus, we have a little bit of inertia to change it, because this is what we know and we've been teaching this and this is what we were taught and so on. But if we get pressure and demand to change, I think that can happen, you know. And it is, yeah, I'm an optimist. I think it is slightly changing. It's going to take a long time, but yeah, nothing's going to happen for sure if there isn't a push from the students, I think. And go into, like, do a PhD in economics, but not in an economics department. You know, like, I was not allowed to do my PhD in an economics department, right? Who would have? No, I tried to get an economics department to accept my project. They wouldn't. To them, it's not economics, right? So do it in somewhere else, and then do your research. And then, you know, now I've gotten into economics kind of, you know, on a different route after the PhD, right? So be brave, I guess. You know, take the route, not, what's the phrase? Take the path less trodden. There we go.
Yeah, and I think that reflection is really important for us, especially for Colombian authors, because, for example, at the University Nacional, we have some authors like Bejarano, I forgot the other, Antonio Garcia, and we don't learn from them that much. So, and we don't talk about decolonizing economics. So I think that those reflections also are really helpful for us in Colombia. I think that there are two other.
Yeah, there's one more question, and then the research paper. I can just, let me share it now. I can just share it in this slide, right? How do I do it? Connect. Let me see. Well, maybe let me do it in a second. I would definitely share the paper. That's absolutely fine. So there's one last question here. Were those authors citing and/or criticizing British economists who were their contemporaries? So Marshall, did you by any chance expand your research towards the history of Indian economics in later years? Okay, so first question, they were definitely responding to author. Yeah, were they responding definitely to contemporary authors? So this period of time, they didn't cite very much. And also just remember, a lot of their texts were speeches. So you don't really cite in speeches, right? So it was more, for me, the tricky thing was to understand where certain ideas looked similar to other people's ideas. And then I could kind of get a sense of where they were getting their ideas. But they were definitely critiquing directly British economists at the time, but they weren't often saying the name. That's also maybe to do with their inability to critique too much. So because they eventually got, in 1885, they got the Indian National Congress, which was this kind of, some people called it a debating society. It was actually supposed to be a political entity, but of course, Indians didn't actually have any political power at the time, but it was kind of to give them a little bit of a carrot, you know, to just say, okay, you be quiet now in the nationalist movement, you get this little debating thing that you do once a year. And they got this space, and then they had to be careful about that space, right, to not lose it, because they knew they could lose it at any time. So criticizing they did for sure, but they did it enveloped in these kind of compliments to the British, right? So yeah, they didn't mention specific economists very much, but that was also maybe, it's also the context at the time. People didn't cite, like, we're obsessed with citations today, right? That was not the case then. And then, did I expand towards the history of economics in later years? No, but there is a PhD student, Sharmin Godaji at the JNU, so the Nehru University in Delhi, that's working on the how the discipline of political economy became a thing in the beginning of the 20th century. And so I can send a link to her site, because she's starting to do more research on that. And then there are other, you know, researchers who work on the interwar period, but that's not my specialty. Camilla, you found the link to the paper?
We had it on our website, so if she can find us, also she can email us and we can
Yeah, awesome. Okay, because
forward it.
I can't figure out how to add it here. That's great.
No, me neither.
I found Sharman's link. So if you're interested, this person who's asking this, this PhD student, she's about to finish too. She's working on that later period. And it's actually quite exciting. It's funny how that happens. You know, there are more and more people working on this, you know.
Okay. I have one more question. No. But let us, no. She's just saying thank you. I have one more question because, to be honest, for me, it's really new, the concept of nationalism versus universalism. And I would like to know if you consider that there is, I mean, I can understand how analytically you can talk about universalism, but in the real life and in the practical life, do you think that there is a way to get practical universalism? I think that everyone in their nation, in their different nations, are thinking about how to develop their own nations. So I don't know how you can explain us a bit how practically we can understand universalism, or if this is just an analytical category.
Yeah, no, I struggled with this myself, and probably still today. Like, how are these reconcilable? You know, either the world just, you know, just to think about, you know, all humans grow in the same way and therefore all nations grow in the same way, or do they not? Are we all, what do you call them in America? Snowflakes, right? We're all snowflakes, because all snowflakes are different, right? But in my sense, so more concretely, if you read the South Asian historians of my period that are, as I said, really excellent, my PhD supervisor, John Wilson at King's, and then the Cambridge historians, they talk about this idea of universalizing trends. And by that, right, it sounds really fancy, but really what we're talking about here is that global markets are becoming ever more interlinked, right? And so if you think about universalism and what does that mean? Well, if a new product comes into your market, it's gonna destroy businesses that are already there, right? And that is a universal fact, right? I mean, when new, you know, products come into your market, then your companies that are selling goods that are perhaps more expensive or less efficient, they will go out of business. You know, Schumpeter's creative destruction is a quite a key concept in economics, which again, it doesn't always apply to all products and over all time, but that is a universal tendency, and that is something we're seeing in India in the late 19th century. For example, we talk a lot about deindustrialization, right? That the trade, the handicrafts industry, where Indians would make beautiful textiles that would sell all over the world, but it was a very kind of one man or one woman kind of job. They didn't really divide labor. They had, you know, fancy machinery compared to other nations some 50 years before, but compared to Manchester, they just could not compete on the global market. And so when the Brits came in, they built the rail tracks, which were able to disperse their products into India. They went out of business, right? But at the same time, their handicraft industry started to disintegrate, but they did have some industrialization, right, in the cotton and the jute industries. They were only in the coastal regions, and they weren't sufficient to bring about, you know, full industrialization and enough capital accumulation to bring about the kind of development that Britain had at the time, right? And I think these are universal themes, right? And I mean, a counterexample is Cuba, right, that kept their economy closed, right? And that's just, I think that's the main example really to understand what I mean by universalizing, right? That there are certain things that once the global markets becomes more and more integrated, there are certain things that happen in every context. Then there are specifics that happen in different regions that are important not to ignore, which is why I think the kinds of research I do and the kinds of research that these historians do is fundamental.
Okay, thanks. I think that there is one question by Santiago.
Yeah, development economics has built a kind of independent branch of economics. From your historical point of view, why is the economics discipline so disintegrated? Do you think there's a philosophical more than technical debate in regard to this big conflicts between mainstream and non-mainstream? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, that's interesting, right? Why does development need its own discipline? Shouldn't all economists be looking at development? Like, shouldn't? And that's a really good question. Amartya Sen asked that question too. It is because they, these economists in Latin America, Prebisch and Singer, and what's the other guy? Anyway, doesn't matter. These the dependency theorists, right? They realize, yeah, but these models don't apply to our economies, and so we need new models. And because economics was such a closed discipline that didn't allow different kinds of assumptions, different kinds of models, they needed their own sub-discipline, right? And so why is that? I really think it is because we have this very dogmatic kind of hierarchical way of organizing our discipline. And so, if you use this method, then you are better than someone else that uses another method, right? And if you follow Adam Smith, then you are better than if you follow someone else that's not as well known. So I think there's a hierarchy there. And is it more philosophical than technical? Yeah, I think it is more. I would say that I'm an historian of economics that deals with philosophy, but yeah, I think it is definitely more of a philosophical debate. I think, mainstream neoclassical economists have so many assumptions that they don't even talk about, right? They assume that rich people are rich because they're better, right? That, they assume that poor people are poor because they're not as good, right? These things, and we don't like to talk about this ever. We like to just say, oh no, but it's because they're more rational, and so on. And so I think, yeah, it's definitely philosophical. It's about realizing that the world has social aspects to it, that the economy has social aspects to it, that just means that you cannot only analyze the economy with empirical studies. And that's an epistemological question, right? It is not just a technical one. So yeah, I hope that answers it. It's a bit of a rant, I'm sorry. But
Thank you, Maria. So anyone else have a question? Also, you can raise your hand and talk directly to Maria. Anyone else?
Me, I have a question.
Okay, Ivo, go ahead.
Maria, in your research, did you identify some insights about culture and religion in Indian economics?
about caste and religion?
Culture and religion, yeah,
cultural.
Culture, yes. What is the role maybe that those Indian economics could develop about it?
Yeah, so not so much. So I mentioned the Indian National Congress that started in 1885, where you really had elites from all over India, especially the north, but all over the north, that would come together from different castes, from different religions, right, Muslim and Hindu essentially, that would come into the same room and would discuss. And that's really quite revolutionary for India at the time. That was quite new, right? Because India is a huge country. I have an Indian friend who says, well, why is India a country? Why isn't it 10 different countries, right? There are lots of different religions, lots of different cultures, if you will. And they came into the same room to debate and basically try to get the British out, right? So they decided from day one that they would not talk about religion or caste, because if they did, they would disagree. And they did not want disagreements among themselves, right? Remember, that's how the Brits got in the first place, right? Divide and conquer, right? Divide and rule, right? And so that's why a lot of these discussions were not had about religion. They may have, like ReDe talked a little bit about caste and how they had to change that system and so on. And they may have talked a little bit about it in other languages. So in the local languages, I have only read their English texts. But yeah, not very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anyone else? Okay, I just want to have the final question if no one is, if no one wants to.
Pedro raised
¿Tú
his hand.
tienes? Ah, Pedro, sorry. Pedro, lo siento. Go ahead, Pedro.
Okay. I'm just turn my microphone, even though my English is very bad. Maria, now that you have mentioned the question that Yvonne asked you about the cultural, and it kind of raised me I don't know, like the doubt about the caste system. Didn't they never mention about that in the win-win model? Like, I mean, because the impression that I get from what you presented us was that they were very modern in the way they were thinking about development. Like very, I wouldn't like to say westernized, but kind of like they were thinking about industrialization and, you know, free trade and all of that. But in caste system, like we are, I mean, the thing that I know about India is that pretty much the caste system limits them. I don't know if that is correct, but that's what I wanted to ask.
Yeah, I mean, no, they don't mention it specifically in the win-win model of development. As I said, really there's an economist, Ambedkar, that talks about caste kind of towards the 1920s, when this starts to be a little bit more acceptable, because there's a bigger consensus about the fact that caste needs to be dealt with, and we need to have less inequality. And that's partly, you know, because of the nationalist movement taking root and being much more, it was much bigger at that time. They had managed basically to create a national feeling, and so then they could start to talk more about caste and that issue. And so I'm sure that these economists would have thought about caste as an issue, but they wouldn't have dealt with it head on, because again, that was not advised. And that's really where these protagonists have a particular context of being political activists with a long-term goal of becoming independent. And so they had to be careful. You know, ReDe got denied a scholarship once in his early career, because he said that the Mughal period had been better for India than Britain. So they had to be careful about what they said, you know. And so the cost wouldn't have been a problem per se for the Brits, but it would have been a problem for other Indian elites at the time, and they wanted to stay friends with them, right? They needed to have that national, and especially at this time, at the late 19th century, at the beginning of the nationalist movement, because they weren't a movement at the time. We call them nationalists now after the fact, right? They did not themselves didn't call themselves nationalists, because if they did, they would not have been given the space to discuss, to have a dialogue with the British at that time. Britain was not ripe for that at that time.
Okay. So I would, if there is not people raising their hands or another question, I would like you to, I mean, it's more like a suggestion for that you can give us, because if we would like to learn more about these authors that have been neglected by the Orthodox Academy, what are your suggestions? Not only about Asian of course, and South Asian authors, but other type of authors, African authors. We are struggling a bit with Latin American authors, but if you have like an advice or a suggestion for us to broaden a bit our curriculum and to learn from other experiences, what would you suggest to us?
Well, so there's, you guys are linked to the YSI, so you know what that is.
We are, but our students, maybe they are not.
Yeah,
so maybe we can try that. Yeah,
well, so there's a working group on Africa, and they had a conference on the history of African economics a few years ago. And I would contact someone called Gerardo Serra, who could give you sources. He's just recently sent me a bunch of sources on, like, there were 2 Ethiopian economists apparently that came up with a new model of development. in the 20th century that, you know, nobody's heard of. So that's from the African point. There, I mean, otherwise, I mean, I think the dependency school would be, those sources might cite other people from Latin America. But I don't know anybody in particular working on history of Latin American economics. Oh, but no, but there's Rebecca, what's her last name? Rebecca. Yeah, she's from, yeah, I can, she does, they actually, so they have an society, a Latin American Society for History of Economics now that's been doing, they're on their like third iteration. You know, they've had 3 conferences so far, and that's huge in their history, right? That they are able to have a whole, so I can send you the name of her after this. She's also very responsive and she'd love to chat with you, I'm sure. And then just in terms of like pluralistic economics, I mean, the rethinking, is it Rethinking Economics? Like they've written a book that's like a textbook, like pluralistic economics, and of course it's like one one chapter per school, so of course they can't mention everything, and that was one of the critiques. You know, there's one chapter on feminist economics, there's one chapter on Marxist economics, but it's a really nice introduction. Let me see if I can find it now quickly, it's here. And yeah, it's definitely rethinking economics, I think. Have you heard of that, Rethinking Economics?
Yeah. I think that one of the professors that are working with us, he talks about it, and I think that they also have like a network. And
yeah, exactly. So they have published a book. There it is, Rethinking Textbook. And really, this textbook is, by the way, and here I'll send the link. This is like a direct counter to the core textbook, which some of you may have seen, the core curriculum, which is INET, who funded the UCL professors to write a new textbook, and there are lots of different authors, right? And I teach it now here at AUP, and it's definitely much better than the traditional textbook, but it definitely doesn't move away from neoclassical enough. And this Rethinking Economics group has said, no way. These are some of the students of that textbook that said, no, that's not enough. We're going to do our own thing. And they got a bunch of funding and then came out with this textbook. And that's like, again, that might not get you to non-European thinkers, but it might get you to kind of start to think about other schools of thought and so on. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I see that you put the link for anyone. If you are interested, Maria, just share the link on the chat. So Maria, thank you very much. I think that we are really happy. I'm sure that some of the students, they were so shy today, but I'm for sure I know that they will start talking about it in the next session that we will have. I want to first give you the word to you, and then to my colleague Isabella, that will invite you, all of you, to the next session, the next webinar. And yeah, from me, thank you very much. It was really nice to read your paper and to hear from your experience, and to know that there is an economist like trying to fight sometimes, but not fight in a bad way. It's more like complement and broad the landscape for economists to understand development. So thank you very much, Maria.
Oh, it's been an honor. I'm really glad you found me and my research, and I feel honored that you're excited by it, and I hope that it gives you the impetus, the idea to do something similar. Because I'm just one person. We need lots of more people doing this, and yeah. So reach out to me at any time, any of you here, if you have an idea or want advice as to where you can go to do kind of more heterodox economics and so on in the world. I'd be happy to hear from you.
Isa?
Great. Thank you, Maria, again, for your time and your excellent presentation and your willingness to talk frankly and openly with us. Thank you very much. We as we say at the beginning, and I think we want to repeat that, we are ReDe, Rethinking Development, Repensando el Desarrollo. We are a reading study group from Colombia, reaching all other parts of the world. We have a weekly seminar reading with students, mainly from Universidad Nacional y Universidad de los Andes from Colombia, but and we have other activities. We have activities as these webinars. We've had Michele Lasevich the previous time. Now we have had you, Maria. Thank you very much. And next time we will have the thing or the webinar that I was talking about quantitative economics, and the title, it's Mathematics and Economics, a dialogue between angels and demons, by Nicolás Páez, who is one of our members. Nicolás is economist and engineer from Universidad Nacional de Colombia, and he holds a PhD on economics from Cambridge. And he has quite a lot of experience in development practice. So that's a thing that also we want to share with like a vision we want to share with our students about the practitioner world. We try to combine this. So hopefully we will see you the next time, and with the students, we want to keep learning and talking to you. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Maria.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you
me.
to American university students for joining us today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.